What if I told you that some presidents spent their retirement changing themselves completely, writing books no one read, starting businesses that barely survived, or disappearing into quiet hobbies like farming, painting, or building furniture? That others couldn't stop themselves from jumping back into politics, creating drama long after their final term. And a few? Well, their lives after the White House got even stranger than their time in office. Yeah, it turns out the story doesn't end when presidents leave the White House. Sometimes it gets weirder. Welcome to a 2-hour journey through the retirements, deaths, and final chapters of every U.S. president. Some retired peacefully, some died in office, and some just refused to leave politics alone, no matter how hard history tried to forget them. Starting with a man who could have been king but chose to grow whiskey instead. So, let's start at the beginning, shall we? George Washington. The man who could have been king but chose not to be, which honestly makes him either the wisest person in American history or someone who really didn't want the job anymore. After 8 years of being president, back when that actually meant something different, when there were no parties to speak of and everyone just kind of made it up as they went along, Washington packed up his things and went home to Mount Vernon. Now, here's the thing you probably didn't learn in school. Washington, the father of our country, the man on the dollar bill, became a whiskey maker. Not as a hobby, mind you. By 1799, his whiskey-making place was producing 11,000 gallons of whiskey a year, making it one of the largest in America. He was literally in the business of getting people drunk. The cherry tree story was a complete lie, but the whiskey empire? That was real. He spent his retirement doing what he'd always loved. Managing his farm, riding around his property, checking on things. Very hands-on, maybe too hands-on. In December of 1799, Washington decided to check on his farms during a snowstorm because apparently checking on crop rotation couldn't wait until the weather cleared. He rode for hours in freezing rain and snow. Came home soaked. And being the stubborn man he was, he didn't change out of his wet clothes before dinner. 2 days later, he woke up with a severe throat infection. His doctors, and I use that term loosely for the 18th century, decided the best thing to do was to drain nearly half his blood, which is about as helpful as it sounds. Washington died on December 14, 1799 at the age of 67, likely from severe throat swelling, though the bloodletting certainly didn't help matters. The man who could have ruled America like a king died because he insisted on checking his fields in a snowstorm. There's something almost beautiful about that. The ultimate person who manages everything killed by his refusal to let someone else do a simple farm check. But of course, Washington wasn't the only founding father with an interesting end to his story. John Adams. John Adams lived to be 90. 90? In a time when making it past 50 was considered beating the odds, the man just refused to die. Probably out of pure stubbornness, which was his most defining quality. Anyway, after losing the election of 1800 to Thomas Jefferson, and losing badly enough that it hurt for years, Adams went home to Massachusetts, to Quincy specifically, and he did what any recently unemployed person does. He started writing angry letters. So many letters. Letters to friends, letters to other founding fathers, letters to newspapers. The man had opinions and by God, everyone was going to hear them. Now here's where it gets interesting. Adams and Jefferson had been friends. Then bitter political enemies. Then they started writing to each other again. In 1812, after 11 years of silence, they began one of the most famous letter exchanges in American history. Over 14 years, they exchanged 158 letters. They argued about philosophy, politics, religion, and basically everything else two old men could argue about. Adams spent his retirement farming badly by most accounts and reading. The man was obsessed with books. He read constantly, wrote notes and everything, and filled the margins with his opinions, which were never in short supply. He watched his son, John Quincy Adams, become president, which must have been both satisfying and slightly annoying. Imagine your kid getting the job you lost. On July 4, 1826, 50 years exactly after the Declaration of Independence was adopted, John Adams lay dying. His last words were reportedly, "Thomas Jefferson survives," which would have been a beautiful thought about his old friend. Except for one small problem. Jefferson had died earlier that same day, just hours before, down in Virginia. 2 presidents, 2 founding fathers, 2 former friends and rivals, dead on the same day, the same date as the Declaration of Independence. 50 years later. If you wrote this in fiction, editors would reject it for being too convenient. But speaking of Jefferson and that very interesting coincidence. Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson died on July 4, 1826. The same day as Adams, which we just covered. But let's go back to what he did with his retirement because the man couldn't sit still even if you paid him. After leaving the presidency in 1809, Jefferson went home to Monticello, his beloved mountaintop estate in Virginia, which he had designed himself because of course he had. Jefferson was the kind of person who couldn't just hire an architect. He had to be the architect, the designer, the inventor, and the client all at once. He spent his retirement tinkering with the house, adding rooms, adjusting windows, and generally making it more complicated than it needed to be. But his real obsession was founding the University of Virginia. Jefferson designed the buildings, selected the books for the library, chose the classes, and even picked the professors. He called it his academical village, which is such a Jefferson thing to say. The university opened in 1825, just a year before his death, and he considered it one of his greatest achievements. More than being president, more than the Louisiana Purchase, he wanted founder of the University of Virginia on his tombstone, not third president of the United States. Speaking of books, Jefferson had a library, a massive, sprawling, obsessive collection of over 6,000 books. When the British burned the Library of Congress during the War of 1812, Jefferson sold his entire personal library to Congress for $23,950. It became the foundation of the new Library of Congress. So, if you've ever used that library, you're basically using Jefferson's old books. But here's the uncomfortable truth about Jefferson's retirement. He died completely broke, deeply, terribly in debt. Years of expensive spending, building projects, and entertaining guests at Monticello had drained him dry. He died owing roughly $17,000. In today's money, that would be well millions. His family had to sell Monticello and most of his possessions just to cover the debts. The man who bought Louisiana died unable to pay his bills. And of course, he managed to die on July 4th because Jefferson had a talent for dramatic timing. Now, some founding fathers had slightly better financial planning. James Madison. James Madison, the father of the Constitution, the shortest president in American history at 5'4", spent his retirement doing what any good editor does, revising his old work. After leaving office in 1817, Madison retired to Montpelier, his tobacco plantation in Virginia, and he did something that seems almost boring, but was actually incredibly important. He spent years editing and organizing his notes from the Constitutional Convention. You know, that little meeting in 1787 where they decided how America would actually work. Madison had taken detailed notes during the entire convention, the most complete record that exists. But he didn't publish them. He kept revising them, editing them, making sure they were perfect. He was preparing them for publication after his death because he knew they'd be valuable to historians, which is either admirably thorough or obsessively careful, depending on your view. He also did what retired Virginia plantation owners did. He struggled with money. Montpelier wasn't profitable. His stepson, Payne Todd, was a gambling addict who kept asking for money. Madison kept giving it to him because apparently even the father of the Constitution couldn't figure out how to say no to family. The debts piled up. Madison stayed engaged in public life without holding office. He advised younger politicians, wrote letters, entertained guests. Montpelier became a kind of pilgrimage site for people who wanted to talk to a living founding father, which must have been exhausting. Imagine being retired and people just showing up at your house wanting to discuss constitutional theory. He lived to be 85, making him the last living founding father, the last person who had been in that room in Philadelphia, who had debated and argued and compromised to create the Constitution. When Madison died on June 28, 1836, an entire generation died with him. The men who had created America were gone. His last words were reportedly spoken at breakfast when someone asked if he was okay. He said, "I always talk better lying down." Then he died. Which is honestly a pretty good exit line for a man who spent his life with words. But not every founding father got a peaceful ending in old age. James Monroe, the guy who gave us the Monroe Doctrine and presided over the era of good feelings, had an ending that was definitely lacking in good feelings. After leaving the presidency in 1825, Monroe retired to his estate in Virginia, which sounds nice until you realize he was completely broke. Like Jefferson before him, Monroe had spent his entire career in public service being paid almost nothing. And unlike modern politicians, he couldn't exactly write a book deal or give speeches for $200,000 a pop. He'd sacrificed his personal finances for his country, and his country wasn't planning to pay him back. Monroe spent his retirement trying to get Congress to pay him back for expenses he'd spent during his decades of diplomatic service. He'd spent his own money on foreign missions, on maintaining households abroad, on everything a diplomat needed to do. He submitted detailed accounts showing he was owed something like $60,000, a fortune in 1820s money. Congress, in its infinite wisdom, decided to give him $30,000 eventually. But here's the most forgotten fact about Monroe. He wrote a 500-page memoir, a massive book about his life, his service, his career. He poured his remaining energy into defending his presidency, explaining his decisions, cementing his legacy, and absolutely nobody published it. Publishers weren't interested. The public didn't care. Monroe died with his memoir sitting in a drawer, unpublished and unread. He lost his wife Elizabeth in 1830. By 1831, Monroe was living with his daughter in New York City because he couldn't afford his own place. The fifth president of the United States died in someone else's house, basically broke, on July 4, 1831, because apparently dying on the 4th of July was just what founding fathers did for fun. 3 presidents, Adams, Jefferson, Monroe, all dead on July 4th. It's almost like they planned it, which would be the most extra thing possible. Meanwhile, the next generation of presidents was taking a very different approach to retirement. John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams did something almost unheard of for ex-presidents. He went back to work. Not in some ceremonial position or cushy ambassadorship. He ran for Congress and won. After losing the presidency to Andrew Jackson in 1828, in one of the nastiest elections in American history, full of accusations and personal attacks, Adams went home to Massachusetts deeply depressed. His wife Louisa thought he might not survive the embarrassment. The man was miserable. But then in 1830, the people of Massachusetts elected him to the House of Representatives, and Adams served there for 17 years. 17. Most ex-presidents would consider serving in Congress beneath them. Adams considered it a calling. He became known as Old Man Eloquent. He fought against slavery, presenting petition after petition to Congress demanding its end, even though the House had a gag rule forbidding discussion of the topic. He ignored the rule repeatedly. He argued with Southern congressmen. He gave passionate speeches. He made himself deeply unpopular with half the country and deeply beloved by the other half. On February 21, 1848, Adams was sitting in the House chamber as usual. The Speaker called for a vote on a resolution honoring generals from the Mexican-American War. Adams, 80 years old, stood up to vote no because he'd opposed the war. Then he collapsed. He suffered a massive stroke right there on the House floor. They carried him to the Speaker's room where he lay unconscious for 2 days. His last words were reported to be, "This is the last of Earth. I am content." John Quincy Adams died in the Capitol building in the room where he'd spent years fighting for what he believed in. If you're going to go, that's honestly not a bad way to do it. Dying at work, literally doing the thing you cared most about. But not every president embraced retirement quite so industriously. Andrew Jackson. Old Hickory himself, the man who won duels and defied Supreme Court rulings and generally terrified everyone around him, retired to his plantation in Tennessee and became surprisingly domestic. After leaving office in 1837, Jackson went home to the Hermitage, his estate near Nashville, and he did something unusual for the time. He stayed there. He didn't run for office again. He didn't try to make a comeback. He just lived as a gentleman farmer, entertaining guests, writing letters, and giving political advice to anyone who asked. Jackson spent his retirement mentoring younger Democrats, basically playing kingmaker from his front porch. He supported Martin Van Buren, then James K. Polk. Presidents came to visit him seeking his blessing. His endorsement still mattered even years after he left office. But here's the interesting part about Jackson's final years. He'd freed the enslaved people he'd held at the Hermitage before his death. Not during his lifetime but in his will, which is complicated because it means he knew slavery was wrong enough to end it eventually, but not wrong enough to end it immediately. That kind of moral contradiction defined Jackson's entire life. He died on June 8, 1845 at the age of 78, surrounded by family and friends. His last words were reportedly, "I hope to meet you all in heaven, both white and black," which is both touching and a reminder of the deep inequalities he'd continued throughout his life. Jackson's funeral was attended by over 3,000 people. They mourned a man who'd been larger than life, whose presidency had fundamentally changed what it meant to be president. He'd expanded executive power, championed the common man, at least the white common man, and left a legacy that's still hotly debated today. Speaking of complicated legacies and presidents who tried to come back. Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren, the little magician, the first president born as an American citizen and not a British subject, spent his retirement trying desperately to become president again. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. After losing to William Henry Harrison in 1840, in an election where Harrison's campaign literally just chanted Tippecanoe and Tyler too, and somehow that was enough, Van Buren went home to Kinderhook, New York, to his estate, Lindenwold, which he had bought specifically as a retirement home. But Van Buren couldn't let go. He wanted the presidency back. In 1844 he tried to get the Democratic nomination. The party said no, choosing James K. Polk instead. Van Buren was furious. So in 1848 he tried again, this time running as the candidate for the Free Soil Party, a third party opposed to the expansion of slavery. He lost badly. He won 0 electoral votes. 0. He split the Democratic vote and helped elect Zachary Taylor, a Whig, which is probably not what he was going for. After that, Van Buren finally accepted that his political career was over. He spent the rest of his retirement traveling through Europe, writing his autobiography, and watching the country slide towards civil war. He supported Lincoln in 1860, which must have felt strange, endorsing a Republican, the party that didn't even exist when he was president. Van Buren died on July 24, 1862, in the middle of the Civil War. He lived long enough to see the Union he'd helped govern start tearing itself apart. His last years were spent in quiet political exile, a former president nobody really remembered or cared about anymore. It's a sad ending for a man who'd been so influential. The little magician who had mastered political machinery and built the Democratic Party into a national force died mostly forgotten. But at least Van Buren had a retirement. Some presidents weren't so lucky. William Henry Harrison. William Henry Harrison has the honor of having the shortest presidency in American history. And by shortest, I mean he died after 1 month. 31 days to be exact. So talking about his retirement is kind of absurd because he never got one. Here's what happened. Harrison was 68 years old when he took office in 1841, making him the oldest president-elect at the time. And he wanted everyone to know he was still strong, still tough, still the military hero who'd won the Battle of Tippecanoe decades earlier. So on March 4, 1841, Inauguration Day, Harrison decided to give a speech. Not just any speech. The longest inaugural address in American history. 8,445 words, 1 hour and 45 minutes in the cold rain without a coat. Because apparently wearing a coat would have made him look weak. He wanted to prove he wasn't too old for the job. Instead, he proved that standing in freezing rain for 2 hours giving a speech about Roman history is a terrible idea. Harrison caught a cold. The cold turned into pneumonia or possibly typhoid fever. Historians debate this. His doctors tried everything, which in 1841 meant bloodletting, opium, and putting leeches on him. Shockingly, this didn't help. On April 4, 1841, exactly 1 month after taking office, William Henry Harrison died. He never got to carry out any policies. He never got to do anything as president except give that one very long, very fatal speech. His last words were reportedly directed at his doctor, but meant for Vice President John Tyler. "Sir, I wish you to understand the true principles of the government. I wish them carried out. I ask nothing more." Harrison's wife, Anna, wasn't even at the White House yet when he died. She was still in Ohio preparing to move. She became a widow before she became First Lady. There's no moral here except maybe, wear a coat. Definitely wear a coat. And speaking of Tyler, who suddenly became president. John Tyler. John Tyler has the unique honor of being the first vice president to become president due to death in office, and also the only president to later side with the Confederacy. So, his retirement was complicated. After finishing Harrison's term and then losing the Whig nomination in 1844 because the Whigs hated him for vetoing all their bills, Tyler retired to his plantation in Virginia. He called it Sherwood Forest because he fancied himself like Robin Hood, an outlaw, which is certainly one way to interpret your own political exile. Tyler spent his retirement farming and fathering children. The man had 15 children by 2 wives, more than any other president. His last child was born when he was 70. He just kept going. But as the 1850s wore on and the nation spiraled towards civil war, Tyler came out of retirement, not to help preserve the Union, but to join the Confederacy. When Virginia seceded in 1861, Tyler supported it. He was elected to the Confederate House of Representatives. Before he could take his seat, he died on January 18, 1862 at the age of 71 in Richmond, Virginia. He was the only president to die as an active member of a government in rebellion against the United States. The U.S. government didn't acknowledge his death. No official mourning, no presidential announcement, nothing. As far as Washington was concerned, John Tyler had committed treason and didn't deserve recognition. It wasn't until 1915 that Congress finally set aside money for a memorial headstone for his grave. Tyler's legacy is thoroughly complicated. He established the rule that vice presidents become full presidents, not just acting presidents, when the president dies. But he also betrayed the Union he'd once served. History hasn't been kind to him. Then again, history isn't kind to people who join rebellions. Speaking of presidents who burned out quickly. James K. Polk. James K. Polk worked himself to death. Literally. The man had no concept of work-life balance. No understanding that maybe you should, rest occasionally. Polk served one term as president from 1845 to 1849. He accomplished everything he said he would. Acquired California and the Southwest through the Mexican-American War, settled the Oregon boundary dispute, reduced tariffs, established an independent treasury. He kept a list of goals and checked them all off. He was the most productive one-term president in American history. He was also exhausted. Polk chose not to run for re-election even though he probably could have won. He knew he couldn't survive another 4 years. He left office on March 4, 1849, looking haggard and worn. His successor, Zachary Taylor, reportedly said Polk looked like a man who'd aged 20 years and 4. Polk went on a goodwill tour through the South, visiting cities, giving speeches, shaking hands because apparently even after destroying himself with work, he couldn't just go home and rest. He got cholera somewhere along the journey. He finally made it back to his home in Nashville, Tennessee in June of 1849. He died on June 15, 1849, 103 days after leaving office. 3 months. He survived his presidency by 90 days. His last words to his wife Sarah were, "I love you, Sarah. For all eternity I love you." Which is touching, but also maybe if he'd loved himself a little more he would have lived past 53. Polk's retirement doesn't exist because he didn't give himself time to have one. He spent every ounce of energy on being president, accomplished everything he wanted, and then died. It's admirable and tragic in equal measure. And speaking of presidents who died too soon. Zachary Taylor. Zachary Taylor, old, rough and ready, the war hero who became president despite never having voted in an election before becoming commander-in-chief, had an even shorter retirement than Polk. As in, he died in office, so his retirement plan was extremely theoretical. Taylor became president in 1849. He was a Southerner who owned enslaved people, but opposed the expansion of slavery into new territories, which made him unpopular with basically everyone. The North didn't trust him because he was a slaveholder. The South didn't trust him because he opposed their expansion plans. On July 4, 1850, yes, another July 4th because apparently that date is cursed for presidents, Taylor attended a ceremony at the Washington Monument, which was under construction. It was blazingly hot. He sat in the sun for hours listening to speeches. When he finally got back to the White House, Taylor was overheated and dehydrated. He consumed large amounts of cold milk, raw cherries and other fresh fruits. Within hours he developed severe stomach cramps. 5 days later, on July 9, 1850, he was dead. The official cause was cholera morbus, which is basically severe gastroenteritis. Modern historians think he probably died from typhoid fever or cholera, both of which were common in Washington's contaminated water supply. There's also a wild conspiracy theory that he was poisoned, which led to his body being dug up in 1991 for testing. Results: he wasn't poisoned. He just died from drinking bad water and eating fruit on a hot day. Taylor's retirement plan was simply not dying while in office. That plan failed spectacularly. He served 1 year, 127 days. His last words were, "I regret nothing but I am sorry to leave my friends." Which is a pretty good attitude, honestly. And just like Harrison before him, Taylor's death meant his vice president suddenly became president. Millard Fillmore. Millard Fillmore is probably the most forgotten president in American history, which is a shame because his retirement was actually kind of interesting. Not good interesting, just interesting. After finishing Taylor's term and failing to get the Whig nomination in 1852, Fillmore retired to Buffalo, New York, and he did something that would have been admirable if it weren't for what came next. He became a civic benefactor. Fillmore helped found the Buffalo General Hospital. He served as the first chancellor of the University of Buffalo. He helped establish the Buffalo Historical Society. He donated books to create the Buffalo Young Men's Association Library. The man loved Buffalo and wanted to improve it, which is honestly nice. But in 1856, Fillmore tried to make a political comeback. He ran for president again, this time as the candidate for the American Party, also known as the Know Nothing Party. Yes, that was their actual name. They were an anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic political movement, and Fillmore was their guy. He lost badly. He carried exactly one state, Maryland. It was humiliating. And it permanently damaged his reputation. Instead of being remembered as the guy who founded hospitals and libraries, He's remembered as the guy who ran for president as a know-nothing. Fillmore spent the rest of his life in Buffalo, continuing his civic work, but largely withdrawn from national politics. He opposed Lincoln and the Civil War, which didn't help his legacy. He died on March 8, 1874 at the age of 74. His last words were reportedly spoken after being given soup. "The nourishment is palatable," which is such a Millard Fillmore thing to say. Even on his deathbed, he was being formally polite about soup. But some presidents had retirements even more tragic than Fillmore's. Franklin Pierce. Franklin Pierce's retirement is one of the saddest stories in presidential history. Not sad in a dignified tragic way. Sad in a slow, painful decline into alcoholism and irrelevance. Pierce left office in 1857, widely considered one of the worst presidents in history. He'd signed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which led to violence and bloodshed. He'd supported slavery and alienated the North. His own party refused to renominate him. He was the only elected president denied his party's nomination for re-election. But his personal life was even worse. Pierce and his wife Jane had lost all 3 of their children. Their last son, Benjamin, had died in a train accident 2 months before Pierce's inauguration. They watched him die. Jane blamed Franklin, believing God had taken their son as punishment for Franklin's political ambitions. After leaving office, Pierce and Jane traveled through Europe trying to outrun their grief. Jane died in 1863, likely of tuberculosis. Pierce was alone. He returned to Concord, New Hampshire, and descended into alcoholism. He'd always drunk, but now he drank heavily. Publicly, he criticized Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War effort, making himself deeply unpopular in the North. His former friends abandoned him. He became a recluse. Pierce died on October 8, 1869 at the age of 64 from cirrhosis of the liver. His last words were, "It's nothing," which could be interpreted as stoic, or as the final resignation of a man who had lost everything. The town of Concord hardly noticed his death. No state funeral, no elaborate mourning, just a quiet burial for a man who had been forgotten long before he died. If there's a lesson here, it's that being president doesn't protect you from tragedy. Sometimes it makes it worse. And speaking of presidents who history mostly forgot, James Buchanan. James Buchanan, the only bachelor president, the man who presided over the nation's descent into civil war while doing essentially nothing to stop it, spent his retirement trying to convince people he hadn't been that bad. Spoiler, he failed. After leaving office in March of 1861, probably the most relieved any president has ever been to leave, Buchanan retired to his estate, Wheatland, near Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and he immediately started working on his memoir. The book was called Mr. Buchanan's Administration on the Eve of the Rebellion, which is already defensive. It wasn't My Presidency, or My Time in Office. It was Administration on the Eve of the Rebellion. As if to say, look, I was just there when it happened, not my fault. The memoir is 300 pages of Buchanan explaining why everything that went wrong wasn't his fault. The South seceded? Not his problem. He claimed he had no constitutional authority to stop them, which is technically true, but also deeply unhelpful when you're the president and states are literally leaving the Union. Buchanan published the book in 1866. Almost nobody bought it. Book reviewers destroyed it. The public didn't care. History had already judged him, and history had decided he was one of the worst presidents ever. He spent his final years at Wheatland, entertaining guests but largely isolated from public life. He supported the Union during the Civil War, which was the bare minimum of patriotic behavior. He died on June 1, 1868 at the age of 77. His last words were spoken to a friend. "Whatever the result may be, I shall carry to my grave the consciousness that I at least meant well for my country." Which is sad because meaning well isn't enough when you're president during a national crisis. Buchanan wanted history to forgive him. Instead, history mostly just forgot him, except when ranking the worst presidents. He usually comes in last. And with Buchanan, we end this first stretch of presidents from the founding generation through the antebellum era, watching them retire, die, and fade into history. Abraham Lincoln. So we arrive at Abraham Lincoln. And here's the thing. There is no retirement story for Lincoln. No quiet years in Springfield. No memoirs written by candlelight. No peaceful fade into history. Just a sudden violent end that came 6 days after the Confederacy surrendered. Lincoln was inaugurated for his second term on March 4, 1865. His inaugural address was short, just 703 words, and included that famous line about, "with malice toward none, with charity for all." He was talking about reconciliation, about healing the nation, about moving forward after 4 years of the bloodiest war in American history. He had 41 days left to live. On April 9, Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox. The war was essentially over. Lincoln was exhausted but hopeful. He talked about Reconstruction, about how to bring the Southern states back into the Union. He was making plans. On April 14, 1865, Lincoln went to Ford's Theater to see a play called Our American Cousin. He sat in the presidential box with his wife Mary and 2 guests. During the third act, John Wilkes Booth, an actor and Confederate sympathizer, entered the box and shot Lincoln in the back of the head. Lincoln never regained consciousness. He died the next morning, April 15, at 7:22 a.m. in a boarding house across the street from the theater. He was 56 years old. His last words are disputed. Some say he told Mary, "She won't think anything about it," in reference to holding her hand during the play. Others report different phrases. The truth is, after being shot, Lincoln never spoke again. Lincoln's body was taken on a 2-week funeral train tour through 7 states, eventually returning to Springfield, Illinois, where he was buried. Over 7 million people reportedly lined the train route to pay their respects. That's almost 1/4 of the entire U.S. population at the time. There's no retirement to discuss because Lincoln never got one. Just a sudden, shocking end right when peace finally seemed possible. History is full of timing that feels cosmically unfair, but this might be the worst example. And then came the man who had to follow him. Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson became president because Lincoln was murdered, which is possibly the worst way to get a promotion in history. After finishing Lincoln's term and barely surviving impeachment, the Senate vote was 35-19, 1 vote short of removing him. Johnson left Washington in 1869. He went home to Tennessee, back to Greenville, where he'd started his political career decades earlier as a tailor. And he was furious. Furious about the impeachment, furious about his treatment by Republicans, furious about everything. Johnson was not a man who let things go. So he did something unprecedented. He ran for office again. Not for president, for Senate. The very body that had tried to remove him from office. In 1872 he ran for Senate and lost. In 1874 he ran for the House of Representatives and lost. Johnson was nothing if not persistent or stubborn. Probably stubborn. Finally, in 1875, the Tennessee legislature elected him to the U.S. Senate. Andrew Johnson became the only former president to serve in the Senate after being president. He returned to Washington in March of 1875, walking back into the chamber where senators had nearly destroyed him 7 years earlier. You have to imagine the atmosphere. Johnson sitting there, surrounded by men who had voted to convict him. The awkwardness must have been spectacular. He gave one speech as senator on March 22, 1875. He spoke attacking President Grant's use of federal troops in Louisiana. It was vintage Johnson, angry, defiant, completely unwilling to move on from old grievances. That was his only Senate speech. On July 31, 1875, just 5 months after taking his Senate seat, Johnson suffered a stroke while visiting his daughter in Tennessee. He died hours later at the age of 66. His last words were reportedly to his physician, "My right side is paralyzed. I need no doctor. I can overcome my troubles." He could not, in fact, overcome his troubles. Johnson's comeback lasted less than half a year, but at least he got his revenge. He'd proven he could return to the Senate that tried to destroy him. Speaking of complicated relationships with politics, Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant saved the Union, served 2 terms as president, and then lost absolutely everything in one of the most spectacular financial collapses in presidential history. After leaving office in 1877, Grant was relatively young, just 54. He and his wife Julia decided to take a world tour. For 2 years, from 1877 to 1879, they traveled through Europe, Asia, and Africa. They met Queen Victoria, the Pope, Emperor Meiji of Japan. It was basically the 19th century equivalent of an extended gap year, except Grant was broke and his friends had to fund the trip. When he returned, Grant tried to run for president again in 1880. He wanted a 3rd term, which would have been unprecedented. The Republican convention said no, choosing James Garfield instead. Grant was disappointed but not devastated. He had other plans. Those plans involved going into business with a man named Ferdinand Ward, who ran an investment firm on Wall Street. Grant put all his money into the firm. So did his son. In 1884, Ward's firm collapsed. Turns out Ward was running a Ponzi scheme. Grant lost everything. His savings, his investments, his wife's jewelry that he'd pawned to cover debts. Grant was broke again at 62 years old. And then he was diagnosed with throat cancer, likely caused by decades of smoking cigars. The cancer was aggressive and painful. Grant was dying, so he did the only thing he could think of to provide for his family. He wrote his memoirs. Mark Twain offered to publish them and promised Julia a generous royalty deal. Grant, in excruciating pain, wrote 1,200 pages in less than a year. He wrote while dying, literally racing against cancer. He finished the manuscript on July 19, 1885. 4 days later, on July 23, he died at a cottage in upstate New York. His memoirs became a bestseller, earning his widow over $450,000, about $13 million in today's money. Grant saved his family one last time with words instead of battles. His last words, written on a notepad because he could no longer speak, were water. And from Grant's dramatic end, we move to someone far more subdued. Rutherford B. Hayes. Rutherford B. Hayes is probably the most boring president in American history. And I mean that as a compliment because his retirement was exactly what retirement should be. Quiet, purposeful, and drama-free. Hayes served one term as president from 1877 to 1881, after winning the most controversial election in history until 2000. Anyway, he lost the popular vote but won the Electoral College by one vote after a congressional commission basically decided the election. The deal involved removing federal troops from the South, effectively ending Reconstruction. Hayes had promised to serve only one term and he kept that promise. He left office in March of 1881 and went home to Ohio, to his estate Spiegel Grove in Fremont. And he just lived there peacefully. He worked on prison reform. He advocated for education, particularly for black children in the South. He served on the boards of various charitable organizations. He took long walks. He spent time with his family. He read books. He wrote letters. He was aggressively normal. Hayes kept a detailed diary throughout his retirement, documenting his daily activities with the kind of mundane detail that would bore you to tears, but is invaluable to historians. On one day he wrote about attending a prison reform meeting. On another about planting trees. Riveting stuff. He never tried to run for office again. Never gave controversial speeches, never started drama with other politicians. Hayes just quietly advocated for causes he believed in and left public life on his own terms. On January 14, 1893, Hayes suffered a heart attack while preparing for a trip to Cleveland. He was at Spiegel Grove. He died 3 days later on January 17 at the age of 70. His last words were, "I know that I am going where Lucy is." Lucy was his wife who had died 4 years earlier. Hayes's retirement was so uneventful that historians barely write about it, which is exactly what he wanted. After a presidency that started with controversy and corruption, Hayes chose peace and purpose. But not every president got such a gentle exit. James A. Garfield. James A. Garfield has the tragic honor of being shot 4 months into his presidency and then spending the next 80 days slowly dying while doctors repeatedly shoved unwashed fingers into his wound searching for the bullet. Garfield was inaugurated on March 4, 1881. He was energetic, intellectual, ambidextrous. He could write Latin with one hand and Greek with the other simultaneously, which is the kind of party trick that impresses exactly nobody, but is objectively impressive. On July 2, 1881, Garfield was at the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station in Washington, preparing to board a train. A man named Charles Guiteau, a disappointed office seeker who believed he deserved to be an ambassador, walked up behind Garfield and shot him twice. The first bullet grazed Garfield's arm. The second lodged somewhere in his torso, probably. Nobody could find it. For the next 11 weeks, Garfield lay in the White House while doctors tried to locate the bullet. They used unsterilized instruments. They dug into the wound with unwashed hands. Alexander Graham Bell even brought a primitive metal detector to try to find it, but it didn't work because Garfield was lying on a bed with metal springs. Garfield developed a massive infection. He lost weight, about 80 pounds. He was in constant pain. The White House doctors issued optimistic bulletins saying he was improving. He was not improving. In September, they moved him to a cottage in Elburn, New Jersey, hoping the sea air would help. It didn't. On September 19, 1881, Garfield finally died. The official cause was blood poisoning and infection. Ironically, if the doctors had just left the bullet alone and focused on keeping the wound clean, he probably would have survived. Garfield was 49 years old. He served as president for 200 days, but was only actively working for about 120 of those. His last words were reportedly, "Oh, Swaim, there is a pain here. Oh, Swaim." Swaim was General David Swaim, his friend. There's no retirement to discuss. Just another president who died too soon. And once again, the vice president became president unexpectedly. Chester A. Arthur. Chester A. Arthur became president after Garfield died and spent his entire presidency secretly dying of kidney disease while trying to look healthy. His retirement was brief because he didn't have much time left. Arthur had been Garfield's vice president, a position he'd gotten mostly through political patronage connections. Nobody expected him to be president, including Arthur. He was a creature of the New York political machine, known for good clothes and late dinners, not for governing. But when he became president in 1881, Arthur surprised everyone by actually being decent. He supported civil service reform, even though it went against everything his political career had stood for. He modernized the Navy. He vetoed pork barrel spending bills. He acted like someone who took the job seriously. The whole time he was dying. Arthur had been diagnosed with Bright's disease, chronic kidney disease, in 1882. He told almost nobody. He tried to run for re-election in 1884, but couldn't get his party's nomination. The Republicans chose James G. Blaine instead, who then lost to Grover Cleveland. Arthur left office in March of 1885 and returned to New York City. He tried to resume his law practice, but he was too sick. The kidney disease was advanced. He was in constant pain, frequently exhausted. In his final months, Arthur did something unusual. He destroyed his papers. He ordered most of his personal and presidential correspondence burned. 3 large garbage cans full of documents gone. Historians still debate why. Maybe he wanted privacy. Maybe he was hiding something. Maybe he just didn't want people picking through his life after he died. Arthur died on November 18, 1886 at his home in New York City. He was 57 years old. He'd been out of office for less than 2 years. His last words were, "Life is not worth living," which is bleak but understandable for a man who had spent his final years in chronic pain. Arthur's retirement barely existed, just a slow decline into death with most of his records destroyed. But some presidents had more unusual post-presidency plans. Grover Cleveland, round 1. Grover Cleveland is unique because he's the only president counted twice. He served as the 22nd and 24th president, which means we have to talk about his retirement twice. Fun. After losing the election of 1888 to Benjamin Harrison. And before you ask, yes, it's that Harrison, grandson of William Henry Harrison. Cleveland left office in March of 1889. He was only 51 years old. Cleveland moved to New York City and joined a law firm. He made a lot of money, more than he'd ever made as president. The firm was called Bangs, Stetson, Tracy and McVeigh, which sounds like a law firm that only represents railroads. And honestly, that's basically what they did. But Cleveland wasn't done with politics. He watched Benjamin Harrison's presidency with increasing frustration. Harrison supported high tariffs and increased government spending, both things Cleveland hated. Cleveland was a believer in small government and low taxes, a Democrat who sounded more like a modern Republican on economic issues. In 1892, Cleveland decided to run again. He won the Democratic nomination and then defeated Harrison in the general election, becoming the only president to serve non-consecutive terms. So, Cleveland's first retirement lasted exactly 4 years. It wasn't really retirement at all. More like a strategic pause, a presidential gap year where he made money and waited for his chance to come back. His first retirement had no ending really, just a transition back into the job he'd left. The interesting thing about Cleveland is that he proved you could lose the presidency and get it back. It had never been done before. It hasn't been done since. Grover Cleveland looked at defeat and said, "Actually no. I'm going back." And somehow it worked. But between his 2 terms, someone else got to be president. Benjamin Harrison. Benjamin Harrison, grandson of William Henry Harrison. Yes, the guy who died after 1 month, served 1 term as president from 1889 to 1893. Then Cleveland beat him in a rematch and Harrison went home to Indiana. Harrison returned to Indianapolis and did what lawyers do. He practiced law. Except Harrison was a former president, so his law practice was a bit more lucrative than most. He represented the country of Venezuela in an international arbitration case. He taught constitutional law at Stanford Law School, though he never formally joined the faculty. But the most interesting thing about Harrison's retirement is that in 1896, at the age of 62, he remarried. His first wife Caroline had died in 1892 while he was still president. His new wife was Mary Scott Lord Dimmock, his first wife's niece, who was 25 years younger than him. His adult children were furious. They boycotted the wedding. They saw Mary as an opportunist, someone trying to get Harrison's money. Harrison married her anyway. They had a daughter together in 1897 when Harrison was 63. So Harrison spent his retirement practicing law, teaching, and dealing with family drama over his May-December marriage. He also wrote a book called This Country of Ours, which was about American government and institutions. It sold moderately well. Harrison died on March 13, 1901 at his home in Indianapolis. He'd contracted influenza, which developed into pneumonia. He was 67 years old. His last words were, "Are the doctors here?" Then, "Doctor, my lungs." Then he died. Which is not the most poetic ending, but it's honest. Harrison's retirement was comfortable, but not particularly notable. He made money, remarried, and quietly faded from public consciousness. History mostly remembers him as the guy sandwiched between Grover Cleveland's two terms. Speaking of Cleveland's second act. Grover Cleveland, round 2. So Cleveland came back, served his second term from 1893 to 1897, and then retired for real this time. Except now he had to deal with the fact that his second term had been kind of a disaster. Cleveland's second presidency was marked by the Panic of 1893, a severe economic depression. Unemployment soared, banks failed, railroads went bankrupt. Cleveland's response was to maintain the gold standard and do very little else, which is a great example of how to make a depression worse. By 1897, Cleveland was done. He didn't run again. He left Washington and moved to Princeton, New Jersey. He bought a house called Westland and just lived there. No law practice this time. No return to politics. Cleveland joined the board of trustees at Princeton University. He became friends with the university's president, Woodrow Wilson, who would later become president himself. Small world. Cleveland spent his retirement fishing, hunting, and writing magazine articles. He wrote a lot about fishing because apparently he really loved fishing. He became overweight and developed health problems. Heart disease, kidney disease, too many cigars, too much food, not enough exercise. On June 24, 1908, Cleveland died of a heart attack at Westland. He was 71 years old. His last words were reportedly, "I have tried so hard to do right." Which is a bit sad because Cleveland's legacy is complicated. He was personally honest in an era of corruption, but his economic policies during his second term made the Depression worse. He tried to do right, but that doesn't mean he succeeded. Cleveland's second retirement was the opposite of his first. No ambition, no comeback plans, just a former president trying to enjoy his final years while history quietly forgot about him. But some presidents never got the chance to retire at all. William McKinley. William McKinley won the Spanish-American War, annexed Hawaii, and presided over a period of economic prosperity. Then he was shot by an anarchist at a public exposition and died 8 days later. So no retirement again. McKinley was inaugurated for his second term on March 4, 1901. He'd easily defeated William Jennings Bryan for the second time. Things were going well. The economy was strong. America had colonies now, Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines. McKinley was popular. On September 6, 1901, McKinley was in Buffalo, New York, attending the Pan American Exposition. He was shaking hands with visitors in a receiving line. Security was minimal because nobody really thought presidents needed heavy security, even after Garfield was assassinated 20 years earlier. Apparently, the lesson hadn't sunk in. A man named Leon Zalgas approached McKinley. Zalgas had a gun wrapped in a handkerchief, disguised as a bandaged hand. He shot McKinley twice in the abdomen at point-blank range. McKinley was taken to a hospital on the exposition grounds. Doctors operated but couldn't find one of the bullets. They stitched him up and said he'd be fine. For a few days it seemed like he might beat it. He appeared to be recovering. Then 8 days later, gangrene set in. McKinley's wounds were infected. On September 14, 1901, he died. His last words to his wife were reportedly, "Goodbye. Goodbye all. It's God's way. His will be done, not ours." Then he apparently began singing his favorite hymn, "Nearer My God to Thee," before losing consciousness. McKinley was 58 years old. He'd served as president for 4 years and 194 days. Zalgas was executed by electric chair 45 days later. He showed no remorse. McKinley's vice president, Theodore Roosevelt, became president. Roosevelt was 42, the youngest president in American history at that point. And unlike some presidents, Roosevelt would actually get a retirement. Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt became president by accident when McKinley was assassinated. He served nearly 8 years, left office in 1909 at age 50, and then proceeded to have the most extra retirement in presidential history. First, Roosevelt went on safari. Not a weekend hunting trip. A full year-long expedition through East Africa, sponsored by the Smithsonian Institution. He and his son Kermit spent March 1909 through March 1910 hunting and collecting specimens. They killed over 11,000 animals including lions, elephants, rhinos. The Smithsonian still has some of the specimens. Then Roosevelt toured Europe, giving speeches, meeting kings and emperors, generally being Theodore Roosevelt at maximum volume. He came home in June 1910 to find that his successor, William Howard Taft, was doing things Roosevelt didn't like. So naturally, Roosevelt decided to run for president again in 1912. He tried to get the Republican nomination but lost to Taft. So he created his own party, the Progressive Party, nicknamed the Bull Moose Party, and ran anyway. He came in second, ahead of Taft, but behind Democrat Woodrow Wilson. Roosevelt split the Republican vote and handed Wilson the presidency. After losing, Roosevelt needed a new adventure. Because of course he did. In 1913 he led an expedition to explore an unmapped river in the Amazon jungle. The River of Doubt they called it. It nearly killed him. Roosevelt contracted malaria and a severe leg infection. He told his son to leave him behind to die. They refused. He survived but never fully recovered. The expedition aged him dramatically. Roosevelt spent the rest of his life writing, giving speeches, and advocating for American entry into World War I. He wanted to lead troops in France. The government said no, probably wisely. On January 6, 1919, Roosevelt died in his sleep at his home in Sagamore Hill, New York. He was 60 years old. A blood clot had traveled to his lungs. His last words were reportedly to his wife, "Please put out the light," which is oddly gentle for a man who had spent his life being aggressively loud. His vice president, Thomas Marshall, said, "Death had to take Roosevelt sleeping, for if he had been awake there would have been a fight." Speaking of men who were nothing like Roosevelt. William Howard Taft. William Howard Taft never really wanted to be president. He wanted to be on the Supreme Court. So naturally he became president first, hated it, lost re-election, and then finally got what he wanted, Chief Justice of the United States. After losing to Woodrow Wilson in 1912, thanks in part to Roosevelt splitting the Republican vote, Taft left the White House in March 1913. He was 55 years old and probably relieved. Taft became a law professor at Yale. He taught constitutional law and enjoyed it far more than being president. He wrote articles, gave lectures, lived in New Haven. He lost weight, about 70 pounds, probably because he was less stressed. But Taft's real goal was getting appointed to the Supreme Court. He'd wanted it his entire life. His wife and brothers had pushed him toward the presidency, but his heart was always in the judiciary. In 1921, Chief Justice Edward Douglas White died. President Warren Harding appointed Taft to replace him. Taft became Chief Justice on July 11, 1921. He was the first and only person to serve as both President and Chief Justice, and he loved it. Taft served for 9 years, helping modernize the court, advocating for reforms, writing opinions. He was happier as Chief Justice than he'd ever been as President. But by 1930, Taft's health was failing. He had heart disease. He was exhausted. On February 3, 1930, he resigned from the court, the first and only Chief Justice to retire. Taft died exactly 1 month later, on March 8, 1930, at his home in Washington. He was 72 years old. His last words aren't recorded, but his daughter reported that he was peaceful at the end, finally free from obligations, finally done with a job he'd never wanted and the job he'd always loved. Taft got what most people want. He found work that made him happy and did it until he couldn't anymore. But the next president wouldn't be so fortunate. Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson won World War I, created the League of Nations, and then suffered a massive stroke that left him partially paralyzed for his final years as president. His retirement was less retirement and more prolonged medical decline. Wilson's second term ended in March 1921. By then he'd been severely disabled for over a year. The stroke happened in October 1919, and Wilson's wife Edith essentially ran the presidency for the final 17 months of his term, deciding which documents he saw, which visitors he met. When Wilson left office, he and Edith moved to a house on S Street in Washington, D.C. Just a townhouse, nothing grand. Wilson was too sick to do much of anything. He could barely walk. His left side was paralyzed. His eyesight was impaired. He tried to practice law for about 2 minutes, opening a firm with his former Secretary of State, Bainbridge Colby. It lasted a few months. Wilson was too sick to work. The firm closed. Wilson spent his final years sitting in his study, receiving occasional visitors, watching movies, silent films, because that's what existed. He liked comedies. He couldn't read much anymore because of his vision problems. He'd been an academic, a scholar, a man who lived in books, and now he could barely see them. The most tragic part of Wilson's retirement is that he witnessed America reject his greatest achievement. The Senate refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles or join the League of Nations. Wilson's dream of international cooperation died before he did. On February 3, 1924, Wilson died at his home. He was 67 years old. The stroke had damaged him permanently, but it took 5 more years to finish the job. His last words were reportedly, "I am ready," which suggests he'd been waiting for death for a while. Wilson's retirement wasn't retirement. It was a long, slow fade while the world moved on without him. And speaking of presidents whose time ended abruptly, Warren G. Harding. Warren G. Harding never got a retirement because he died in office. But his death deserves mention because it's one of the strangest presidential deaths in history. Not because of how he died, but because of the conspiracy theories that immediately followed. Harding became president in 1921, and his administration was almost immediately engulfed in scandals. The Teapot Dome scandal, where his Secretary of the Interior took bribes to lease federal oil reserves. Various officials taking kickbacks and embezzling money. Harding himself wasn't directly involved, but he'd appointed the crooks. By mid-1923, Harding knew his presidency was falling apart. He decided to take a cross-country tour, partly to escape Washington and partly to gauge public opinion. He called it the Voyage of Understanding. The trip exhausted him. Harding gave speeches in dozens of cities, shook thousands of hands, kept a brutal schedule. In Seattle he fell ill. Doctors initially said it was food poisoning from eating bad crab. Later they said pneumonia. Then a heart attack. On August 2, 1923, in a hotel room in San Francisco, Harding died. He was 57 years old. His wife, Florence, was reading to him from a newspaper. He seemed fine. Then he just died. Probably a heart attack or stroke. Florence refused to allow an autopsy, which immediately sparked conspiracy theories. Did she poison him? Did someone else? Was it really natural causes? The most likely answer is that Harding had severe heart disease and the stress of the trip killed him. But because there was no autopsy, people have speculated for a century. His last words were to Florence, "That's good. Go on, read some more." Then he died, which is at least peaceful if nothing else. Harding's administration is remembered as one of the most corrupt in history. His retirement plan was surviving long enough to see how bad the scandals would get. That plan failed. Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge became president when Harding died, served out the term, won re-election, then shocked everyone by announcing he wouldn't run again in 1928. He left office in March 1929, and actually got a retirement. Coolidge went home to Northampton, Massachusetts. He moved into a house called the Beeches and proceeded to do as little as possible, which was very on brand for Silent Cal. He wrote a newspaper column for a while. It was distributed to newspapers nationwide. Coolidge wrote about politics, current events, and fishing. Especially fishing. The man loved fishing. The column was fine. Not brilliant, not terrible, just Coolidge being Coolidge. He also wrote his autobiography, which sold well mostly because people were curious about a man who barely spoke. The autobiography is short, understated, and reveals almost nothing about his inner life. Perfect Coolidge. Coolidge spent most of his retirement quietly. He'd walk into town. He'd sit on his porch. He'd go fishing. He avoided public life. When people asked if he missed being president, he said no. He seemed to mean it. On January 5, 1933, Coolidge died suddenly at the Beeches. He'd been shaving in the morning, came downstairs and collapsed. Heart attack. He was 60 years old. He left a note on his desk that just said, "Too many years." Nobody's quite sure what he meant. Too many years alive. Too many years since his son died in 1924. Too many years watching the world change. Coolidge's last words were apparently just to his wife. Something mundane about going upstairs. Then he died. Quick, quiet, without drama. It's exactly how Coolidge would have wanted it. No fuss, no ceremony, just a sudden end to a life spent saying as little as possible. And with that, we move beyond the early 20th century and toward presidents who would live to see the modern world. Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover has the longest retirement of any president in American history. 31 years, 3 entire decades. The man who presided over the start of the Great Depression outlived almost everyone from his era and spent his retirement trying to rebuild his reputation. Hoover left office in March 1933, deeply unpopular. The Depression had destroyed his presidency. Unemployment was at 25%. Banks were failing. People were living in shanty towns called Hoovervilles. They blamed him for everything. He was only 58 years old. Most presidents who leave office at that age find something else to do. Hoover found everything else to do. He wrote books, lots of books. Memoirs, political treatises, analyses of American government. He was prolific. He also wrote articles for magazines and newspapers, constantly defending his presidency and explaining what he thought went wrong. But Hoover's real work was in public service. During World War II, even though he was a Republican and Franklin Roosevelt was a Democrat who had defeated him, Hoover helped coordinate food relief efforts for Europe. After the war, President Truman, another Democrat, asked Hoover to help address the post-war food crisis. Hoover organized relief operations that fed millions of people. In 1947 and again in 1953, Hoover chaired government commissions on reorganizing the executive branch. The Hoover Commissions they were called. They recommended hundreds of changes to make government more efficient. Many of those recommendations were actually implemented. Hoover lived long enough to see his reputation partially rehabilitated. He became an elder statesman, someone both parties consulted. He attended both Republican and Democratic conventions. He was invited to state dinners at the White House. On October 20, 1964, Hoover died in his apartment in New York City. He was 90 years old. He'd outlived Roosevelt. Truman was still alive but wouldn't last much longer. Hoover had survived into a completely different America than the one he'd left. His last words were reportedly to his physician, "I am not afraid," which is almost touching because Hoover had spent his entire post-presidency fighting to prove he hadn't been the failure everyone thought he was. 31 years. That's longer than many presidents lived, period. Hoover's retirement was almost as long as his entire pre-presidential career. But the man who defeated him wouldn't get anywhere near that much time. Franklin D. Roosevelt. Franklin D. Roosevelt died in office, so there's no retirement to discuss, but his death deserves mention because it happened at such a pivotal moment in history. Roosevelt was elected 4 times, the only president to serve more than 2 terms. He led America through the Great Depression and most of World War II. By 1945, he'd been president for 12 years. He was exhausted, sick, and pretending he wasn't. Roosevelt had advanced cardiovascular disease, high blood pressure, congestive heart failure. His doctors knew, his staff knew, the public didn't know. Roosevelt kept up appearances, giving speeches, meeting with world leaders, pushing through meetings even when he could barely stay awake. On April 12, 1945, Roosevelt was at his retreat in Warm Springs, Georgia. He was sitting for a portrait. The painter, Elizabeth Shumatoff, was working. Roosevelt was signing documents, chatting with cousins who were visiting. Suddenly Roosevelt said, "I have a terrific pain in the back of my head." Then he slumped forward, unconscious. He'd suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage. He died a few hours later at 3:35 p.m. He was 63 years old. Roosevelt never saw the end of the war. Germany surrendered less than a month later. Japan surrendered in August. He'd brought America through almost the entire conflict and died before the victory. His last words before losing consciousness were about the pain in his head. Not some grand statement about democracy or freedom, just pain. Vice President Harry Truman became president without warning. Truman had barely been briefed on anything. He didn't even know about the atomic bomb project until after Roosevelt died. Imagine becoming president and immediately finding out you have a weapon that can destroy entire cities. Roosevelt's funeral train went from Georgia back to Washington, then to Hyde Park, New York, where he was buried. People lined the tracks weeping. He'd been president for so long that many Americans couldn't remember anyone else in the job. There's no retirement story, just an abrupt end to a presidency that had already lasted longer than any other. And then came the man who had to follow him. Harry S. Truman. Harry Truman left the presidency in January 1953 and went home to Missouri, to Independence specifically, to the same house he'd lived in before becoming president, and he just walked around. Truman was famous for his morning walks. Every day he'd walk briskly through the neighborhood, usually at a pace that made Secret Service agents struggle to keep up. Except Truman didn't have Secret Service protection. He refused it. He thought it was unnecessary, so he just walked around Independence like a regular person, stopping to chat with neighbors, buying his own groceries. Truman spent his retirement writing his memoirs. 2 volumes, Year of Decisions, and Years of Trial and Hope. He also wrote letters. So many letters. Truman loved writing letters, especially angry ones he'd never send. He'd write furious responses to critics, seal them in envelopes and file them away. Therapeutic, probably. Money was an issue. Former presidents didn't get pensions back then. Truman's only income was his Army pension, $112.78 per month. He was essentially broke. He had to sell some family land to pay bills. In 1958, Congress finally passed the Former President's Act, giving ex-presidents a pension. Truman got $25,000 a year. Hoover also qualified, though he donated his to charity. Truman was offered corporate board positions and speaking fees. He refused most of them, believing it would be undignified for a former president to cash in on the office, which is admirable, but also meant he struggled financially. On December 26, 1972, Truman died at a hospital in Kansas City. He'd been admitted with lung congestion that developed into organ failure. He was 88 years old. His last words were reportedly a slurred Bess or Best, his wife's name. He was trying to say her name, but couldn't form words clearly anymore. Truman's retirement was exactly what you'd expect from a man who once said, "The buck stops here." No pretense, no special treatment, just a former president being a regular citizen in his hometown. But the next president would take a very different approach to post-White House life. Dwight D. Eisenhower. Dwight Eisenhower left the presidency in January 1961, retired to his farm in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and discovered his true passion, painting. Not good painting necessarily, just painting. Eisenhower had started painting during World War II as a way to relax. During his presidency he painted occasionally. After leaving office, he painted constantly. Landscapes mostly. He'd set up his easel and paint scenes of his farm, of Augusta National Golf Club, of whatever struck his fancy. He was mediocre. Art critics politely said his work showed enthusiasm, which is art critics speak for. Well, he tried. But Eisenhower didn't care. He painted because he enjoyed it. He gave paintings to friends. Some are in museums now, not because they're good, but because a president painted them. Eisenhower also played a lot of golf. A lot. He was a member at Augusta National and he'd spend weeks there playing round after round. The club even had a cottage named after him, Mamie's Cabin, named for his wife. But Eisenhower's retirement wasn't all leisure. He wrote his memoirs, The White House Years, a 2-volume set that was dense and detailed. He consulted with Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, offering advice on foreign policy and military matters. Both men respected him enough to actually listen. On January 17, 1961, in his farewell address, Eisenhower warned about the military-industrial complex, the dangerous relationship between government, military, and defense contractors. It became one of the most famous presidential speeches in history, delivered on his way out the door. Eisenhower's health declined in the late 1960s. Heart problems, multiple heart attacks. On March 28, 1969, he died at Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington. He was 78 years old. His last words were to his son John. "I want to go. God take me." He'd been suffering for years and was ready to die. Eisenhower's retirement was active, engaged, and surprisingly artistic. He went from commanding armies and leading nations to painting barns and playing golf. It's about as American as you can get. But some presidents never got that chance. John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy was assassinated on November 22, 1963. So there's no retirement to discuss. But his death fundamentally changed how we think about presidential security and, in a strange way, presidential mortality itself. Kennedy was 46 years old when he died. The youngest elected president, killed before he could even finish his first term. He was riding in an open-top convertible through Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas. Lee Harvey Oswald fired 3 shots from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. One shot hit Kennedy in the head. He was pronounced dead at Parkland Memorial Hospital at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time. His last words are disputed. Some witnesses say he said, "My God, I've been hit," after the first shot. Others say he said nothing. He likely lost consciousness immediately after the fatal shot. What makes Kennedy's death different from earlier presidential assassinations is the visual documentation. The Zapruder film captured the entire event on 8mm film. The world could watch the president die over and over. It became seared into the national consciousness. Kennedy's funeral was watched by millions. His 3-year-old son, John Jr., saluting his father's casket. The riderless horse. Jackie Kennedy in her black veil. The images are iconic. There's no retirement story because there was no retirement. Kennedy exists in American memory as eternally young, eternally potential, eternally, what if? What if he'd lived? What would his second term have looked like? Would Vietnam have gone differently? Would civil rights? We'll never know. Kennedy was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. An eternal flame marks his grave. It's still burning over 60 years later. Vice President Lyndon Johnson became president aboard Air Force One, still parked on the tarmac in Dallas, with Jackie Kennedy standing beside him in her blood-stained pink suit. Johnson didn't want to delay. He needed to establish continuity of government immediately. Kennedy never had a chance to leave the presidency on his own terms, just a sudden violent end in Dallas. And Johnson, suddenly president, would eventually get the retirement Kennedy never had. Lyndon B. Johnson. Johnson left the presidency in January 1969, exhausted and hated by half the country over Vietnam. He went back to his ranch in Texas and promptly let himself go. Johnson had been a man obsessed with power and control. As president, he worked 18-hour days, bullied senators, pushed through massive legislation like the Civil Rights Act and Medicare. He was larger than life. Then he retired and stopped caring about his appearance entirely. He grew his hair long, really long, shoulder length, 70s hippie long. The man who'd been president during the Vietnam War started looking like the protesters who'd opposed it. He stopped trimming his hair, stopped caring what anyone thought. He wore jeans and old shirts and walked around his ranch doing whatever he wanted. Johnson spent his retirement chain smoking, 3 packs a day, even though he'd had a heart attack in 1955, and his doctors had begged him to quit. He also drank heavily. He was essentially speed-running his way to an early death. He worked on his memoirs, The Vantage Point, but he seemed disconnected from it, like he was writing about someone else's presidency. He granted interviews, watched his presidential library being built, but mostly he just existed on the ranch. On January 22, 1973, Johnson suffered a massive heart attack at the ranch. He called the Secret Service for help. They found him dead in his bedroom. He was 64 years old. The cruel irony, he died 2 days before the Paris Peace Accords were signed, officially ending American involvement in Vietnam. The war that had destroyed his presidency ended 48 hours after he did. Johnson's last words were into the phone to the Secret Service. "Send Mike immediately." Mike was the Secret Service agent on duty. Johnson was dead before Mike arrived. His retirement lasted only 4 years. He spent it retreating from public life, growing his hair and waiting to die. Speaking of long hair and cultural shifts, Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon resigned the presidency on August 9, 1974, the only president to resign, and spent the next 20 years trying to rehabilitate his reputation. Spoiler, it sort of worked but not really. Nixon left Washington in disgrace. Watergate had destroyed him. He faced possible impeachment and criminal prosecution. President Ford pardoned him a month later, which probably saved Nixon from prison, but also ensured he'd never fully escape his crimes. Nixon went to his estate in San Clemente, California, La Casa Pacifica. He fell into a deep depression. He was physically ill, phlebitis in his leg. He almost died from complications after surgery. Some say he wanted to die. But Nixon was nothing if not resilient. By the late 1970s, he'd started his comeback. He wrote books, 9 of them. R.N. The Memoirs of Richard Nixon was his first, published in 1978, then books on foreign policy, on leadership, on his relationship with world leaders. He positioned himself as an elder statesman on foreign policy. He traveled the world meeting with leaders, offering advice. He consulted with Presidents Reagan, Bush, and Clinton. They all met with him privately, seeking his insights on China and Russia. Nixon moved to New York City in 1980, then to New Jersey in 1991. He kept writing, kept giving interviews, kept trying to be relevant. On April 18, 1994, Nixon suffered a massive stroke at his home in New Jersey. He died 4 days later, on April 22, with his daughters at his bedside. He was 81 years old. His last words were reportedly, "I hope I haven't let you down," which could be interpreted multiple ways, to his daughters, to the country, to himself. Nixon's funeral was attended by President Clinton, all living former presidents, and thousands of people. He'd managed a partial redemption, becoming a respected voice on foreign policy, even if his presidency remained stained by Watergate. But the man who pardoned Nixon had his own post-presidency ahead. Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford left the presidency in January 1977, never having been elected to the office, and proceeded to have one of the most financially successful retirements in presidential history. Ford was the accidental president, appointed vice president after Spiro Agnew resigned, then became president when Nixon resigned. He served 2.5 years, lost to Jimmy Carter in 1976, and went home to California. Unlike Truman, Ford had no qualms about cashing in. He joined corporate boards, lots of them. He gave speeches for huge fees, up to $100,000 per speech by the 1980s. He made millions. Ford believed that if corporations wanted to pay for his name and his advice, that was fine. Ford also played golf constantly. He was infamous for hitting spectators with errant shots. There are compilations of Ford hitting people with golf balls. He became a running joke on comedy shows, portrayed as clumsy and accident-prone, even though he'd been a college football star. But Ford also did meaningful work. He supported the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library and Museum. He spoke out on political issues, usually advocating for moderate Republican positions. He remained friends with Jimmy Carter, the man who had defeated him. Ford lived to be 93 years old, making him the longest-lived president until Carter eventually surpassed him. On December 26, 2006, Ford died at his home in Rancho Mirage, California. His last words were to his wife Betty, "I love you," which is about as sweet and simple as it gets. Ford's retirement lasted 29 years. He went from accidental president to wealthy elder statesman to the longest-lived president of his era. Not bad for a guy who was never supposed to be president in the first place. And speaking of Carter, Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter lost re-election to Ronald Reagan in 1980, left the White House deeply unpopular, and then proceeded to have what is arguably the best post-presidency in American history. Carter went home to Plains, Georgia. Population 700. He was 56 years old and basically unemployed. He and his wife Rosalind were broke. They had put their peanut farming business in a blind trust during his presidency and it had been mismanaged. They owed over $1 million. So Carter wrote a book, Keeping Faith, Memoirs of a President. It sold well enough to pay off the debts. Then he kept writing. He's written over 30 books now, more than any other president. Fiction, poetry, memoir, political analysis. The man can't stop writing. But Carter's real work was the Carter Center, founded in 1982. The center focused on global health, democracy promotion, and conflict resolution. Carter personally traveled to dozens of countries, observing elections, mediating conflicts, working to eradicate guinea worm disease. In 2002, Carter won the Nobel Peace Prize for his decades of humanitarian work. The Nobel Committee specifically cited his post-presidential efforts, not his presidency, which is maybe the ultimate example of a career redemption arc. Carter also became famous for Habitat for Humanity. Starting in 1984, he and Rosalind spent weeks each year building houses for low-income families. Carter, a former president, swinging a hammer in the summer heat. He continued doing it into his 90s. He taught Sunday school at Maranatha Baptist Church in Plains almost every week for decades. Anyone could show up and hear a former president discuss Bible passages. In 2023, Carter entered hospice care at home. As of this recording, he's still alive, having surpassed Ford as the longest-lived president. He's 99 years old. Carter transformed what it means to be a former president. He made it about service, not profit. But his successor took a very different path. Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan left the presidency in January 1989 at age 77, the oldest president to leave office at that time. He went home to California and gradually disappeared into Alzheimer's disease. Reagan and his wife Nancy moved to Bel Air, Los Angeles. He set up an office in Century City. He gave a few speeches, made some public appearances, started working on his memoirs. Everything seemed fine. Then in November 1994, Reagan wrote a letter, a handwritten letter to the American people, announcing he had Alzheimer's disease. "I now begin the journey that will lead me into the sunset of my life," he wrote. "I know that for America there will always be a bright dawn ahead." It was quintessential Reagan. Optimistic, poetic, dignified, and it was goodbye. Reagan lived for another 10 years after that letter, but he was no longer really present. The Alzheimer's progressed. He stopped recognizing people. He stopped speaking. Nancy cared for him, becoming fiercely protective, limiting visits, trying to preserve whatever dignity remained. Reagan died on June 5, 2004 at his home in Bel Air. He was 93 years old, pneumonia complicated by Alzheimer's. He'd been essentially gone for years by then. His last words aren't really known because he hadn't been verbal for a long time. But his daughter, Patty Davis, reported that he opened his eyes one final time, looked at Nancy, and then died. A moment of clarity at the very end. Maybe. Reagan's funeral was a massive state event. His body lay in state at the Capitol. He was buried at his presidential library in California overlooking the Pacific Ocean. His retirement was long but ultimately tragic. A man whose strength had been communication spent his final decade unable to communicate at all. And the pattern of long retirements would continue. George H.W. Bush. George H.W. Bush left the presidency in January 1993 after losing to Bill Clinton. He was 68 years old and handled the loss with remarkable grace, which isn't surprising because Bush was basically the human embodiment of gracious behavior. Bush retired to Houston and to Kennebunkport, Maine, splitting his time between Texas and New England. He wrote books, gave speeches, and most importantly, he stayed out of politics. He didn't criticize Clinton publicly. He didn't undermine his successors. He just quietly supported them when asked. But here's the most fun fact about Bush's retirement. The man became obsessed with skydiving. He'd been a Navy pilot in World War II, and he'd bailed out of a damaged plane over the Pacific when he was 20. He decided to mark milestone birthdays by jumping out of planes again. He jumped at age 75, age 80, 85, and at age 90 he made his final jump tandem over Kennebunkport. 90 years old, former president, jumping out of a plane because why not? Bush also became close friends with Bill Clinton, the man who defeated him. They did charity work together, traveled together, became an odd couple of sorts. Two presidents from different parties who genuinely liked each other. Bush's health declined in his final years. He developed vascular Parkinsonism, which left him unable to walk. He used a wheelchair. His wife Barbara died in April 2018. Bush attended her funeral, barely able to sit up, clearly heartbroken. 7 months later, on November 30, 2018, Bush died at his home in Houston. He was 94 years old. His last words were reportedly to his son George W. Bush on the phone. "I love you too." Bush's retirement lasted 25 years. He spent it jumping out of planes, making friends with his former opponents, and being the kind of elder statesman everyone could respect. Meanwhile, the man who defeated him was creating his own unique post-presidency. Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton left office in January 2001 at age 54, one of the youngest ex-presidents in modern history. He'd survived impeachment, but his presidency ended under a cloud of scandals. He had a lot of time left and a lot of reputation to rebuild. Clinton did what he did best. He talked. He gave speeches, thousands of them, for enormous fees, often over $200,000 per speech. He made tens of millions of dollars just talking. He also wrote books. My Life, his memoir, sold over 2 million copies. In 2005, Clinton founded the Clinton Foundation, focusing on global health, climate change, and economic development. The foundation did genuinely good work, but also attracted controversy over donor relationships and potential conflicts of interest, especially when Hillary was Secretary of State and then ran for president. Clinton also underwent heart surgery in 2004. Quadruple bypass. It forced him to change his lifestyle. He became a vegan, lost weight, started exercising. He's written about his dietary changes, becoming an unlikely advocate for plant-based eating. But Clinton never really left the spotlight. When Hillary ran for Senate, he campaigned for her. When she ran for president in 2008 and 2016, he campaigned for her. He spoke at Democratic conventions. He advised presidents. He stayed relevant. Clinton's had health scares, a second heart procedure in 2010, a urological infection in 2021, but as of now, he's still going. Still giving speeches, still involved with his foundation, still being Bill Clinton. His retirement isn't really retirement. It's more like a continuation of his political career through different means. He's created a model where ex-presidents remain active, visible, and influential for better or worse. And his successor took yet another approach. George W. Bush. George W. Bush left office in January 2009 with some of the lowest approval ratings in modern history. The Iraq War, Hurricane Katrina, the financial crisis. His presidency ended in chaos. He went home to Texas and essentially disappeared from public life. Bush moved to Dallas. He bought a house in a quiet neighborhood. And he started painting. Not occasionally, obsessively. He took lessons. He painted every day. He got pretty good. His subjects were interesting. He painted portraits of world leaders he'd known. Then he painted portraits of wounded veterans, soldiers who'd been injured in the wars he'd sent them to fight. He published books of his paintings. The veteran portraits are genuinely moving. Whatever you think of Bush's presidency. Bush also spent time at his ranch in Crawford, Texas, the Western White House, during his presidency. He cleared brush, rode his mountain bike, lived quietly. He stayed out of politics almost entirely. He didn't criticize Obama. He barely commented on current events. He built his presidential library at Southern Methodist University in Dallas. It opened in 2013. He attends events there occasionally but generally keeps a low profile. Bush has said he's content in retirement. He seems to genuinely be. He reads, he paints, he spends time with his family. He doesn't seem to miss the presidency at all. He's made a few public appearances. Most notably, his friendship with Michelle Obama became a wholesome internet moment when they were caught passing candy to each other at events. An unlikely friendship between an anti-war Democrat's wife and the president who started 2 wars. Bush is now 78. His retirement has been long, quiet, and remarkably uncontroversial. After 8 years of non-stop controversy, he seems to prefer being boring. And speaking of staying engaged with politics, Barack Obama. Barack Obama left office in January 2017 at age 55. Young for an ex-president. And unlike Bush, Obama didn't disappear. He stepped back but stayed visible, creating a new model of how former presidents can remain influential. Obama and his family initially stayed in Washington so his younger daughter could finish high school. They bought a house in the Colorama neighborhood. It felt unusual. Most ex-presidents leave Washington immediately. Obama stayed. He wrote a memoir, A Promised Land, an 800-plus page book that was part autobiography, part policy explanation. It was a massive bestseller. Volume 2 is reportedly still in the works, because apparently Obama needs more than 800 pages to tell his story. Obama and Michelle signed a deal with Netflix to produce documentaries and films through their production company, Higher Ground. They made several successful projects. Obama also started a podcast, interviewing celebrities and politicians. He remained very much in the public eye. He campaigned for Democratic candidates in 2018, 2020, and 2022. He spoke at conventions. He raised money. He advised President Biden. Obama hasn't formally led the party, but he's clearly still influential. Obama also focused on his presidential foundation and library in Chicago. Construction has been delayed multiple times, but it's moving forward. There's been some criticism that Obama hasn't fully stepped back, that he's too present, too willing to comment on his successor's presidencies. But he's also been more restrained than he could be. He's created a middle path, engaged but not dominating. Obama is currently 63. His retirement is barely a decade old. He's young enough that he'll be a presence in American politics for decades to come. Whether that's good or bad depends on your politics. But his successor created an entirely different kind of post-presidency. Donald Trump. Donald Trump left office on January 20, 2021. Except he didn't really leave. Not psychologically, not practically. He's created a post-presidency unlike any other, one where he's refused to accept that it's over. Trump moved to Mar-a-Lago, his private club in Florida. He turned it into a pseudo-White House, holding court, meeting with supporters, plotting his return. He gave speeches. He held rallies. He never stopped campaigning. He launched his own social media platform, Truth Social, after being banned from Twitter and Facebook. He posted constantly, relitigating the 2020 election, attacking opponents, staying in the news cycle. Trump was impeached for a second time right before leaving office for his role in the January 6 Capitol riot. The Senate acquitted him again. He became the first president impeached twice. He was indicted multiple times. Federal charges for mishandling classified documents. State charges in Georgia for trying to overturn the election. State charges in New York for business fraud. Federal charges for his role in January 6. Trump became the first former president criminally indicted. Then the first former president convicted of crimes. 34 felony counts in the New York case. And through it all, Trump announced he was running for president again in 2024. He won the Republican nomination and won the presidency again, becoming only the second president to serve non-consecutive terms after Grover Cleveland. Trump's retirement wasn't retirement. It was a 4-year campaign. He golfed a lot, yes. He lived at Mar-a-Lago, but he never stopped being a candidate. He never accepted being a former president. His post-presidency rewrote the rules because Trump doesn't follow rules. He created a model where ex-presidents stay in the arena fighting, campaigning, refusing to fade away. Love him or hate him, Trump's approach is historically unprecedented. And now he's president again, which means his retirement is over. But there's one more president to discuss. Joe Biden. Joe Biden is still serving as president as of this recording in 2025. So talking about his retirement is speculative. But we can talk about what likely comes next. Biden will be 82 when his term ends in January 2025, making him the oldest president to leave office. He's already said he won't run again. His retirement is coming whether he's ready or not. Biden has spent his entire adult life in politics. He was first elected to the Senate in 1972 when he was 29 years old. He served 36 years in the Senate, then 8 years as vice president, then 4 years as president. That's nearly 50 years in Washington. So, what does someone do after 50 years in politics? Biden will probably write a memoir. Presidents always do. He'll likely speak at events, campaign for Democratic candidates, stay somewhat engaged with politics. But at 82 the pace will be slower. Biden has talked about spending more time in Delaware, where he's always gone on weekends, going to his home in Wilmington, being near family. His life has been marked by personal tragedy. Losing his first wife and daughter in 1972, losing his son Beau to cancer in 2015. Family has always been his anchor. He'll probably establish a Biden Center or foundation like most modern presidents. He'll focus on whatever causes matter most to him. Cancer research maybe, given his son's death. Foreign policy, given his decades on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. But honestly, Biden's retirement will likely be quieter than recent presidents. He doesn't have Obama's youth or Clinton's energy. He won't paint like Bush. He'll probably just rest finally. His last words as president, whenever that moment comes, will probably be something about democracy or unity or the soul of America. Biden loves those themes. He'll mean it sincerely. And with that, we've covered all 46 presidents from Washington to Biden, from 1789 to 2025. Some retired peacefully, some died in office. Some never stopped fighting. All of them eventually had to let go of power. And that's where we'll pause for now. There you have it. 46 presidents, 236 years of American history. Some lived into their 90s. Some barely made it past their inauguration speech. Some built libraries and taught Sunday school. Others just painted a lot. From Washington dying because he refused to wear a coat in a snowstorm to Trump refusing to accept that retirement was even a thing. Every single one of them eventually had to face the same truth. The presidency ends whether you wanted it to or not. Some handled it with grace. Some handled it with long hair and chain smoking. And some handled it by writing books nobody bought, defending decisions nobody cared about anymore. But here's the thing, they were all just people. People who happened to have the hardest job in the world for a little while, and then they had to figure out who they were when that job was over. Some figured it out, some didn't, and some died before they got the chance. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, just remember, if a president can survive leading a nation through civil war, economic depression, and constitutional crisis, you can probably survive whatever awkward thing you did at work today. Sleep well and be grateful you'll never have to write a memoir defending your life choices to future historians. Good night.